Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Robin, and I'm with GFAS, and I want to thank you all so much for attending today. I'm really excited about the session we have planned for you. But before we get started, I wanted to go ahead and just go over some general housekeeping information with you. First, we are recording this webinar, so it's really nice to be able to go back and view any information that you missed. And Lois, as soon as I get started, I can see if I can help you out with the audio and see if we can fix that for you. But I do want to mention that your phone lines are muted. Oh, I'm sorry, I was talking about the recording. We are recording this session. We will send up a link to that as soon as it's processed, probably tomorrow. What's nice about the recording is that you can go back and view the information that you might have missed, or if you have other members of your team who you think might benefit from the information, they can go ahead and take a look at that also. Your phone lines are muted. That's only to help with distraction from background noise when we get a number of people on the phone at the same time. But if you're having any technical issues, please feel free to use the chat box over on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'll be happy to help you out. Also, this is a very interactive session. We love your questions, so please feel free to type those into the chat box throughout the presentation, and we will pass those along to the presenter. Again, if you have any technical issues, type those into the chat box also. I'll be happy to help you out. It is now my pleasure to go ahead and pass this over to Kelly Heckman, the Executive Director of GFAS, who will get us started. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Robin. I appreciate that. And hi, everybody. My name is Kelly Heckman, and as Robin mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, or GFAS for short. And I'm happy to bring you today the second part of our Avian Roundtable series, which we're sponsoring with Avian Welfare Coalition. And today we're going to be focusing on a different set of issues than we had last week, but we're going to be talking about issues that are ongoing with shelters that have avian programs already in place. GFAS is an accreditation body that evaluates care and management practices for sanctuaries, rescue centers, and rehabilitations all over the world. And our objective in sponsoring these series is to help you, animal shelters and rescues, provide better short-term care for the birds that come to you in need. But again, as Robin mentioned, to make this as useful as possible, many of you have already submitted questions, but we also know that, as we're going through these discussions, that new questions will be, popping in your head. So please be sure to ask those questions in the chat box. And before we get too far in, I just want to remind you that GFAS does have several resources that you might find helpful. If you go to our webpage, sanctuaryfederation.org, we have animal care standards for 24 different taxa, 3 of which are avian focused. We also have gotten a lot of feedback from this roundtable series about adoption and placement. So we plan to revisit this topic in the next couple months with a series specifically focused on adoption and placement. So look forward to that. But also, I want to remind you that last year we held a 3-part series, a comparable webinar series that you can find all of those presentations still recorded and available on our website as well. We have an avian education page, and that specific address will come up at the end of the presentation. And if you missed last week's roundtable discussion with Dr. Pilney, that is also now available on our avian webpage. And then, for additional resources, don't forget that ASPCA Pro and animalsheltering.org are both really great resources for animal sheltering issues at large. And then, of course, the Avian Welfare Coalition is an amazing resource for a lot of the issues that we'll be talking about today. And with that, I will actually hand over the mic to the president and co-founder of Avian Welfare Coalition, Denise Kelly.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate everyone joining us today. We have a full agenda, so I wanted to make my comments brief. For those of you who are not familiar with the Avian Welfare Coalition, we formed back in 2000 to create a voice in the animal protection community for captive birds. Our website has served for years as a resource on various issues, and one of our most important programs is our shelter outreach, and we've developed several resources, both printed and online, that are available at avianwelfare.org/shelters. And this includes our handbook, Captive Exotic Bird Care, a guide for shelters. We also have downloadable how-to guides for shelters on a variety of topics that are germane to care within a shelter environment. And, of course, this amazing opportunity to partner with the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries to present these webinars, both last year's series and this year's, and future webinars, which I'm hoping everyone will join us in a few months for the one that Kelly mentioned, which will be dedicated to adoption. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our presenter, and just to remind everyone that this is intended for short-term care. We do advocate for much higher standards for birds who are in permanent sanctuaries and in homes, and we'll be talking about that more in the adoption series. And our presenter today is Lorelei Tibbetts, who is a practice manager at New York's only exotic pet hospital, the Center for Avian and Exotic Medicine. She's originally from Boston, received her BA in journalism from Boston University, and then a BS in veterinary technology. Lorelei's worked exclusively with exotic pets since 2003, and in addition to being an adjunct teacher of avian and exotic medicine at a local veterinary technology program, she's lectured at several National Veterinary Symposium. She's also a founding member and current president of the Vet Tech Specialty Group of the Academy of Veterinary Technicians in Clinical Practice, and she specializes in exotic companion animals. So welcome, Lorelei.
Thanks, Denise. That's great. And thank you guys for joining us today. I really, really enjoy giving these and helping with these webinars because one of the most important topics that we can really face in veterinary medicine is what happens when these animals are no longer wanted and end up in sanctuaries or rescue organizations. And it's really my great pleasure to be able to help in any way that I can as far as educating people on how to do right by these animals. So thanks for coming. So these are just some of the topics that we're going to touch on today. This webinar is really based on questions that we've received from some of you and different people who have specific questions about their own facilities in general about rescuing and sanctuary for birds. So those topics are going to include allocating space, some safe handling techniques, basic housing, veterinary care and quarantine, behavior and enrichment. Again, keeping in mind what Denise mentioned, that this is really for short-term placement. This isn't about long-term placement, permanent needs for birds. This is kind of what you can expect that you'll need to do when you're caring for these birds short-term. So question one regarding allocating space. This was a question we got. I apologize, I'm not sure who submitted it, but we are in the process of building a new facility and plan to have a large aviary as part of it to retire exotic birds that are unwanted. This is so awesome. I love that this is happening. So whoever you are, this is great. What advice can you give as far as introducing birds to one another and adequate space and separation from the different species? So what we're talking about here is how do we do this safely as far as birds that might fight, how many birds can fit in an enclosure, what species may or may not get along. And these are often really hard questions to answer because birds it can really depend on their own temperament, and birds have, very personal temperaments. Some guidelines that I would like to suggest would be when birds do tend to fight, it is generally about territory, which means space. So using this picture, this image that we see, there's at least 3 different kinds of birds in this very nice large aviary. There's cockatiels, lovebirds, and what looks like maybe a canary wing parakeet over here on the left side of the picture. They're similar-sized birds, and they can absolutely cohabitate and not necessarily fight as long as they have adequate space to get away from each other, especially if they're able to fly and if they're able to have places to kind of be by themselves. And a lot of this is also going to depend on the amount of food and water areas that are available to them. If you have this many birds and potentially significantly more in an enclosure that has only 2 food dishes, there definitely will be fighting and potentially some serious fighting. Even among these small birds, they can really hurt each other. I would, as far as introducing them and how to make this safe, I would also assume my basic recommendations would be to not combine much larger birds than this in an enclosure. Even birds like conures, I would probably consider putting in a separate enclosure, certainly not any cockatoos, macaws, things like that. This should really be the limit for small birds. And likewise, I wouldn't mix in canaries and finches with the hook-billed parrots. So some ideas and things that might be helpful would be when you get birds on intake, don't immediately take them and throw them into a large aviary. There should obviously be a quarantine practice where the birds are kept separately, and once they've been deemed healthy for whatever that quarantine period is and whatever you guys choose as your protocol for quarantine, I would suggest, if possible, having the new birds be in an area where they can see and hear and communicate with the birds that are in the flight cage, whether it's a small cage that's next to it or near it, so they can kind of get an idea of who their new friends or neighbors are going to be. And ultimately, there will be the day of introduction, and it's fine to go ahead in a large aviary and let these birds just go into it and see what's going to happen, as long as somebody is there to monitor and make sure that safety is always a priority for them, and that these birds aren't getting bullied. Part of the bullying aspect of birds in a large aviary is going to be if someone's sick. So keep in mind that if you have a bird that's not well, a flock will gang up on them. They don't want a sick animal in the flock. It attracts attention. They will keep them away from food and water sources. They can attack them. So that's something to be aware of when you're combining different species in a large aviary setting. So do be careful and diligent in making sure that any bird that doesn't look well is removed from a large aviary. But in general, these birds can cohabitate and can do well together if they have the space and if they have enough food and water sources. I hope that answers the question. I don't see any new questions coming in about this specific topic. Going down the line as we go through these slides, if people do have questions regarding what I'm talking about, please feel free to write them in, and I'll try to get to them before we flip slides to move on to the next. So if there's something I haven't touched on or questions that come up, absolutely let me know. So we'll move on. The next question was regarding some safe handling as far as what is the most fragile group of birds to handle and what are considerations for handling small, medium, and large birds. So it's an interesting question because certainly the obvious answer would be, well, small birds are more fragile than large ones, but that shouldn't scare you from handling small birds, and you're going to have to do it. Little finches, canaries, and even parakeets and parrotlets and some of the really small birds, when they're nervous, can pass out. They can actually have fainting episodes. That is definitely something to be aware of. It can be quite startling and alarming, even if you haven't done anything wrong. Just hyperventilating and nervousness can make these birds kind of literally pass out in your hand. So be aware of that anytime you're handling small birds. But they certainly can be handled and picked up. A small bird like that is easy to transfer. You don't need to worry too much about getting bitten or terribly injured yourselves if you're moving or just transporting one bird from one enclosure to another, which is mostly what you're going to be doing. That doesn't mean the larger birds don't need to be handled with care and can't become extremely stressed and damaged. And some of the damage that I'm referring to isn't necessarily physical damage. When we're handling birds, we have to kind of learn body language and what it means when a bird is afraid versus what it means when a bird is angry and going to be aggressive towards you. So keep in mind that when you say you're taking a towel and you're going to grab a bird from a carrier and place it in a cage, that experience for the bird can be incredibly traumatic and literally scar the bird emotionally for potentially forever from being scared of towels, scared of hands. So I think in a short-term placement type situation, my recommendation would be, especially with those more nervous birds that aren't going to step up on your hand and are really scared, would be not to handle them as much as possible. If you can transfer a bird from a carrier to a cage by literally holding, set the cage up, get its food, get its water, everything set, let the bird go in the cage without handling it too much, that would be ideal. The handling should really only be if you need to do physical exam on the bird, and hopefully there's somebody who has a little more experience restraining the animals. One of the things that we had been talking about before we started today's seminar is creating some videos on restraint techniques, and we will be posting those to the GFAS website at some point, and I think that is going to be helpful. I think it's hard to just describe how to handle these animals. Sometimes you have to see it, and you always have to practice it. So the answer to this question in a nutshell is they're all kind of fragile. You can damage them physically and mentally, and be aware of the different ways they can also hurt you with these larger birds with those beaks. A comment just came in. Lefever.com may have some of that material on handling. For those of you who don't know about Lefever.com, it is a fantastic resource for all different kinds of exotic animals, not just birds, and they absolutely might have some great videos on handling techniques, so definitely check it out. I'm not sure that I've seen one on bird handling with them, but they may have one, and it's a great resource in general, so thanks for that. So moving on from handling, what do you do if a bird escapes? This will happen and does happen all the time. Some of the things to first consider is where you're going to be putting these birds, because I can promise you it will happen at some point, whether or not, and it has nothing to do with whether or not you as the caretakers are careless and left the bird door open. Some birds are master escape artists. They can lift doors, they can undo locks and undo latches, and they can get out. So making sure these birds are located in rooms that are inherently bird safe is a very good idea if possible, meaning I wouldn't set my rescue bird room in a same room where there were predatory animals or where there was ceiling fans whirring or things that birds could big wide open windows that the birds could fly out of, or anything like that could be a significant harm to them should they escape, because it will happen. But even if you have practiced those safety techniques, the birds can still fly out a door and get into a different part of the facility, and accidents happen. So what do you do? A couple of things to remember about birds is that when it's dark, they tend not to fly. When they can't see, they tend to stay still. So one of the first things we do when we have a bird that isn't going to, and of course this is assuming the bird isn't going to just happily step up on your hand and go back to the cage. We're referring here to birds that are happy to be out of the cage and do not want to go back in it. So turning lights off is a great idea. Of course, that the bird would need to be in range of you, meaning somewhere that you can reach it, or at least so that you can see where the bird is. So it may not be in complete darkness, but dark enough that the bird is kind of nervous to fly, but you can still see it. And in instances like this, you may need to do what I don't like doing, which is throwing a towel on a bird or something that could potentially emotionally harm the bird. Unfortunately, there are times that for the bird's safety, you may need to do that. But that being said, I really don't approve of techniques like netting. I have seen birds that have been injured, wings that can get caught in nets, feet, toes, things like that, and that can be really damaging. Towels tend to be safer. Big sheets just to get the bird, contained so that it's not injured and so that it's kept safe. Some birds may be hesitant to step up on your hand, but not hesitant to step up on an inanimate object. A lot of people, believe it or not, are scared to have their birds step up on them, so they stick train them. And I've met many birds that are fearful of your hand or don't even know that they're supposed to step up on it, but will happily step up on a broom handle or some sort of a long perch. So if the bird is out of reach or if the bird doesn't want to step up on your hand, you could try something like that to get the bird to step up onto it. You could also, assuming you have time and the bird isn't in a dangerous situation, you could just leave a cage open with its favorite food or junk food in the enclosure. A lot of times birds will be food motivated. At some point they're going to get hungry and they're going to go back into their cage for food. But of course that would only be if you've got the time to allow the bird to go back on its own. That would of course be ideal because it would be least stressful for the bird, but that's not every situation is going to afford you to have that much time. So I think in general, be prepared that this is something that's going to happen. Have some kind of a plan for your own facility and what you can do to not necessarily prevent this from happening, but what you're going to do in the event when it happens. I don't see any specific questions here. We're going to move on. Next question was regarding housing. Could you explain the difference in needs for smaller versus larger birds in regards to, what kind of an enclosure? So, again, we're talking short term here. When clients ask me this all the time, well, how big of a cage do I need? Well, there's no limit. Remember, long term anyway, birds are meant to be flying hundreds of miles, dozens of miles, depending on the species, every day. And so there really is no limit to the upper range of a cage size. So I usually tell people, well, the largest cage you can afford that will fit in your home is the one you should purchase. That's not going to hold necessarily true for every rescue or even long-term facility organization. But depending on what your budget is, I can tell you from personal experience, we have a boarding room at our veterinary hospital, and over the last 10 years, I've never once had to purchase a cage because so many people are upgrading or getting new cages and they want to donate their cages. So there's always a lot of resources if you have good networks for people who are looking to donate cages of all different sizes. So that's a good way to not spend money. And so a lot of it may just come down to space. But short term, these birds don't need a huge amount of space. So looking at this picture on the right with this lovely large corner aviary type cage, sure, it would be fantastic if you could put a couple of conures in there, even a macaw or two. That would be great. Will they be okay in a smaller cage for a short period of time? Yes, absolutely. They need to be able to have certain parameters, such as budgies, finches, doves, pigeons. Those birds fly. They're not big climbers, so they might need areas that they can literally spread their wings and fly from perch to perch. Whereas parrots, larger parrots, are more climbers. I have a macaw. I can't get her to fly. I've never trimmed her wings, and she's handicapped, but has nothing to do with her wings. And I wish she would fly, but she doesn't. She climbs and walks around on her handicapped foot. Point being, you don't necessarily need huge short-term cages for larger birds, but they do need to be able to fit into a cage where they can spread their wings, turn around, and have some reasonable amount of space to climb from perch to perch so that they're not going to be damaging their feathers or their plumage, and have a comfortable stay. Somebody presented a question, what do you consider a short period of time, a week, a month, half a year? To me, a short period of time is, I guess I wouldn't want a bird living in small conditions for more than a month. At that point, I would really worry about, muscle atrophy, emotional damage for a bird that's not going to be able to exercise or fly or get around a lot. So physical and emotional damage, more than 3 or 4 weeks, I would be concerned about that. But certainly, short period of times, a week, 2 weeks before these birds are sent somewhere to more longer-term care or set up for more longer-term care, they're going to be okay in a small enclosure as long as they have those basic requirements met. All right, moving on. How big does an enclosure need to be for short-term needs of a shelter? So this image on the left is 2 little birds in literally a cat carrier, and they would not be happy in this cat carrier for multiple days or even upwards of a week. But if these birds in an emergency situation needed to be there overnight or even for 2 or 3 days, there's plenty of room in here for them to walk around, get food and water. You could, you could fit 1 or 2 perches in there, and their basic physical needs are going to be met for a couple of days. So I think there really is, emergency situations where this wouldn't be considered, worst case scenario. They're going to be okay. I wouldn't want these birds left in there for, more than a week or 2. So I guess some of the information I would give here would be similar to what I already said. Birds need to be able to, larger parrots need to be able to climb without their tails and wing feathers rubbing or being, forced to rub against bars. You're going to see feather damage. They're going to need to be able to spread their wings. A lot of times birds, when they're not able or given the opportunity to fly, they will aggressively flap their wings inside of the cage, which is a good thing. It's stretching their muscles, getting their heart rate elevated. It's something I like seeing when birds do that because I think it's healthy for them emotionally and physically. So they need to be able to do that. I hope that answers those questions. Somebody posted, can you make a recommendation about lighting for enclosures during temporary foster care, i.e. natural versus incandescent versus full spectrum? There's been some studies that show certain incandescent or fluorescent lights have pulsations that are very irritating to birds. I can't speak specifically about that research, but I try to stay away from fluorescent lighting for birds in general when possible. Natural light is ideal if there are windows or any kind of opportunity for them to have natural sunlight is fantastic. Full spectrum light, meaning bulbs that produce UVA and potentially UVB, depending on the kind of bulb you get, rays, are great. I don't think birds need this in a short-term facility care. I think it's more than they need. But hey, if you have the resources to do that, it's not wrong to do the best you can do. So go for it. And as far as just general lighting, I think basic incandescent light is fair and reasonable for short-term situations. All right. What are safe disinfectants for cleaning cages, perches, and toys? So birds are really, really messy. They poop kind of constantly. They throw fruit, and hopefully you're able to give birds fruit and vegetables in the setting that you guys are going to be having to work with. And they love spreading it all over themselves and their perches and the bars of the cage. So cleaning is really important, and hygiene is really important for these birds. Here at our practice, one of the things that's really important is we rotate our cleaning products. We don't want to build resistance by using just one kind year after year. So every 6 months we transition to a different disinfectant. Some of the ones that we have used that are safe are dilutions of chlorhexidine. One of them is called trifectant, and one is called a Virkon S. And these are all cleaning agents that get made and diluted. We use them as sprays. We use them to soak food, perches, and even whole cages in. They work by contact time. It's important that when you use them, you don't just spray and wipe. You need to have them, depending on which one you're using, read the instructions, but sometimes upwards of 5 minutes to actually have contact time in order for the disinfectant to do its job, killing fungal organisms, some viral organisms, and bacteria. So just be aware of the different needs of your cleaning products. And it's not just about soaking. Like this perch that you see on the top there, that's going to need to be scrubbed. So I'm really big on my cleaning staff, and I literally took pictures of when I feel that things aren't done cleaned properly. I'll take pictures of it and show it to them at our staff meetings. So I think it's important to make sure that you emphasize to whoever's doing the cleaning in your facilities that it's not just spraying and wiping with a tissue. It's getting those perches out of the cage, soaking them, scrubbing them, rinsing them, which is the other part of it. You don't want to leave those chemicals on there. As much as they are, quote, animal or bird safe, we don't want our birds licking on them and chewing the wood and things like that, so make sure they're rinsed really well. People ask a lot about bleach, and I just wanted to mention bleach is a fantastic disinfectant. It's kind of the gold standard, kills everything, but it really isn't safe to use around birds, especially in concentrated amounts. So we don't use that here on a regular basis, especially if there's birds around. So I would be aware of bleach is not something I would use all the time. Somebody's asking a question about products, safe to use around birds. I think that's what we just touched on. All right, we'll move on to the next slide.
And I'm sorry, Lorelei, I just wanted to jump in. She added a part to that question asking, safe as in you can spray an item in the same room?
Yes, absolutely. Yep, the items that I mentioned, we use all the time in the same room. We will remove a bird from a cage, put it somewhere else. We clean everything, rinse everything down, and put the birds back in. But the bird is in the same room, absolutely, yeah. I wouldn't keep the bird in the same cage and then wipe the perch down. I would take the bird out of the cage. I wouldn't want it to be aerosolized directly in the bird, but you can clean in the same room. That's what I mean when I say bird safe. Any aerosolized smells or things that can cause irritation to birds' lungs and air sacs and eyes and things like that, these products are safe for birds, whereas something like bleach is not. Okay, veterinary care and quarantine. How often or what situations should an avian vet visit the shelter? This is going to depend a lot on your avian vet, your budget, and how feasible it's going to be to have them there. Of course, it would be fantastic if every bird that is presented gets a thorough physical exam and workup by an avian vet. Probably not practical for most situations. So when we're doing kind of damage control care, how do we know when they need to be seen? I would recommend maybe even LefebvreVet.com again. They do have some good information on triage of birds and other exotic animals. But it's important to recognize some obvious signs of illness that will require more, aggressive care from a veterinarian. So, for instance, a lot of birds that are going to be presented to rescues are given up for medical problems. People can't afford the veterinary care, so they give the birds away rather than euthanize them or rather than, just not get them the care. And a bird like this Goffin's cockatoo is a self-mutilator. This is usually a behavioral problem, although there are some medical reasons that this can start. But a wound like this obviously is going to need some kind of veterinary care. And then there's the little cockatiel on the right who's squinting, his eyes missing feathers around his eye is red, and he just isn't feeling good. So the signs aren't quite as obvious as a big gaping wound in the chest, but he's obviously not feeling well. Birds that are presented to a sanctuary situation should be alert, and they should be wide-eyed and looking around and nervous. Their feathers should be tight against their bodies. They're in a strange situation, and by nature, when birds are not comfortable, they are not, at ease, and they should look as much. So when a bird comes in and they're fluffed up, or they're closing their eyes, or they're falling asleep, or they're not responding to physical, being touched, or looking like they're, literally don't care that they're in a new situation, is telltale signs that something might not be right. And may definitely warrant an avian vet visit. As far as how often, I think depending on how many birds you have at your shelter, it would be great to have maybe quarterly visits, to have a veterinarian come over, and even if they just put their hands on the birds, they're going to be able to see things that a lot of personnel may not be able to see, as far as signs of illness, lumps and bumps on a bird, and just kind of overhaul what's happening in the facility. An avian vet is just going to recognize problems that, as great as a lot of facilities are, they may not recognize. So quarterly would be great. If not, biannual would be good. Annual, in my opinion, wouldn't be enough if you have a significant amount of birds. Let's see, we have a question that came in. What can be done in-house by someone who has worked with birds for years but isn't a vet? Suturing, amputation, say toe has been bitten, giving injections. Well, I certainly don't think anybody should be suturing any animal up without a veterinarian being present, regardless of their experience with birds. I mean, I've been working with birds for many years, and I wouldn't suture an animal without a veterinarian, just because legally you're not allowed to do it. And it's not going to be, it may not be something that's necessary. A lot of times people think, such as the amputation example, just because a bird's toe is bitten doesn't mean it needs to be amputated. It may heal, part of it may heal, and when I think of suturing or amputations, I would imagine that if you're doing this kind of on your own in-house, you're not going to have proper pain management, antibiotics, and things like that on hand to be able to do those procedures properly. So I would strongly advise against things like that. I think having someone who's worked with birds for years, who is experienced, can be capable of giving injections at a veterinarian's instructions. Almost anyone can be taught to do this, and it's a very, very valuable thing to learn. Even gavage feeding with a tube, giving subcutaneous fluids, things that we call supportive care are so important. And if you have an avian vet who's willing to teach experienced staff members how to do that, may be a situation that the avian vet can say, this is what I prescribed for this bird. This is what I want you to do, and if they've trained you how to do it, I do think that's reasonable. But when it comes to surgical procedures or things that are going to be painful, I would strongly recommend not doing those things. So I hope that answers your questions regarding vet visits. I don't see other questions coming in, and we will move on to the next. Can you touch on birds that have difficulty perching? If there are no physical injuries present, what could be causing this? Well, there are actually a lot of things. I guess the first thing I would say, just because there isn't a present physical injury doesn't mean there wasn't one at some point. A broken foot, a broken ankle, a broken leg that heals inappropriately, even just a few weeks later, if it's healed crooked or healed incorrectly, could cause a bird not to be able to perch or have difficulty perching. Other things that aren't necessarily trauma-related would be age-related changes like osteomyelitis and arthritis and things that can happen as birds get older, sometimes associated with infection and inflammation, sometimes just old age. This is when it might be a good idea if you have a bird and your vet is able to come around for quarterly visit, say, hey, this bird really doesn't get around well, isn't perching well. They might be able to take a look and give you an idea of if it's something congenital or maybe even something the bird was born with that they have trouble perching. I have a rescued Amazon parrot who was a splay leg as a baby, and she can perch, but she doesn't perch well and she doesn't get around well. She falls at night. I have to put pillows in the bottom of her cage every night. And to look at her, you might not see it now. She's an adult. Her legs are under her. They're not splayed out and sticking up like some of the birds are because we got her young enough that we were able to sort of correct it, but it's not normal. So that's a congenital problem she had since she was a baby. So there are a lot of things that are non-trauma related that can make a bird just not get around well. Denise mentions here lead poisoning or neurological disorder. These are more medical issues, and absolutely lead poisoning or viral neurologic disorders can cause a bird to not be able to perch. You would be seeing other symptoms, though, in conjunction with that. So if a bird looks completely normal, eating, drinking, pooping normally, bright-eyed, vocalizing, acting totally normal, but has trouble perching, it's probably one of the things I already mentioned. If a bird is lethargic, not eating well, perhaps passing blood in their stools or having diarrhea or undigested seed or undigested food in their stool, those are symptoms that there's something else, something else going on. It's not just a congenital or arthritic problem. And that's a sick bird. And some of those things are fixable, some are not. That's when it would be time to call on an avian vet and get some advice with that bird. Somebody mentioned, do you recommend wrapping wood perches with vet wrap? So if you look at this picture, there's like a dowel perch there that's very smooth and round. It doesn't have a varying diameter or any surface for this bird to grasp on. So this would be a perfect example of a case where I would absolutely recommend wrapping this in vet wrap or some sort of tape that would give it some sort of a surface that a bird won't be so slippery and won't be as hard for them to hold on to. You could also just get perches, like natural wood perches tend to be easier for birds to get around on. They've got little knobs and knolls and things that different diameters, different surface for them to grasp, and those are easier for birds to get around on. But I do love vet wrap for wrapping things. It also keeps things sanitary. If you, rather than soaking and scrubbing, wrapping perches in vet wrap is something that we sometimes do here, both to protect the bird's feet and to protect the perch. So thanks for that question, because I do think that's a good thing to do in many instances. All right, moving on. Behavior and enrichment. My question is about co-housing birds that are not bonded pairs. What is the best way to introduce two birds that are social with each other, but not a bonded pair, so that they can be placed together? This cute picture of two very different species. One of them is cockatoo. One is an Amazon parrot, a little Hispaniola, and it looks like, and they have no right being friends. They're from completely different continents, but yet here they are looking like buddies. It's one of those things where you never really know ahead of time when a bird is going to befriend another one. A lot of times birds are kind of desperate for companionship, and they will readily bond with a bird of a different species because they just want someone to touch them, to groom them, to be next to and have companionship with. It's one of those things that is actually kind of sad sometimes, because in a perfect world these birds would have a mated pair that they could actually communicate with on a level that they'd understand each other better. But a second runner-up is having any companion, in my opinion, and I think it would be great if you guys could help encourage birds to become a bonded pair. Safe ways to do it? Well, if they already look like they're kind of getting along or interested in each other, it's going to be kind of supervised visits. You're going to have to take the plunge at some point, and I would recommend taking the birds to an area that isn't near either one of their cages. Again, birds can be territorial, so taking them to a third cage out of view from either of the cages they have, or a different room altogether. Having lots of treats available, things to distract them in case they do start to squabble, giving them rewards for being near each other, and seeing how they interact. Body language is so important, and you guys will have to just learn what is aggressive body language versus what is not. If one bird is approaching the other with its beak open, is it because it's going to bite the other bird or because it's going to preen the other bird? And these are subtle differences that you will learn over your experience working with birds. But it can be done. I think it's a great idea to introduce birds and give them companionship, especially if it's in long-term situations. They should have a friend. You just need to be careful and know that they can hurt each other. I don't know that I've ever seen any specifics as far as gender issues. Some male birds love each other and get along. Some male birds fight viciously, and same with females. It doesn't always have to be male-female. It doesn't have to be female-female, male-male. They all, depending on their own desires and their own personalities, could potentially bond with any bird. I mean, I've seen macaws and budgies that get along well with each other. My Amazon parrot that I mentioned before is bonded to my Genday conure. They live together in a cage. I had them both at home, and they moved in together. It kind of scared me at first, but I monitored them, I watched them, and before I knew it, they were preening each other and happy. But meanwhile, they do not get along with the handicapped macaw. So you just have to be aware, watch body language, and make sure that they're not being aggressive towards each other. Somebody put a post up in our shelter. It is way more difficult to adopt out bonded pairs. Do you have any recommendations to help the potential adopter understand that a bonded pair can be just as wonderful? Note, we do not split bonded pairs unless it's for health reasons. Thank you for making that comment. That's great. And yes, please don't split bonded pairs. It's heartbreaking. A lot of these birds mate, for life and have been together for years and years, and it's just heartbreaking to think that anybody would separate them. What I tell people anytime I'm adopting out any animal that is bonded to another one, I like to push on people the benefits of having two animals. It completely decreases the amount of stress that you're going to have as a pet owner as far as having a pet, the novelty of a new parrot is great. They're fun, they're interactive, but over time that novelty will wear off a bit, and you're going to want to, go out to dinner and not rush home right after work, and you're going to start to feel guilty about your 8-hour, 10-hour work days, and you're going to all of a sudden, wish that your bird had something else to do other than screaming for your attention. And by suggesting to people that having a bonded pair will eliminate that stress in your life is huge. I pretty much have great success adopting out bonded paired of animals when I present it that way. And speaking from personal experience, I agonize about my macaw who doesn't have a bonded friend, and I'm so much more comfortable with my other birds. I know they have each other, and I hate that I feel so guilty when I need to run home to my macaw because she needs me. She needs to have me there. So I would just encourage people, tell them personal stories about why this is easier. And if somebody has another bird at home that they're looking to bond one bird to, that's great, but just don't split the pair up. It should be a deal breaker, in case you guys don't already know that. So, thanks for that question. Behavior and enrichment. Our staff and volunteers would interact with the birds, but what can we do in shelter to socialize them and provide them enrichment other than toys and mirrors? Some birds are too fractious and do not seem comfortable with handling. I would imagine a lot of birds that show up in shelter situations are going to be fractious and not comfortable with handling. So some ideas as far as enrichment other than toys and mirrors. I love food enrichments because it's just a way that birds and a lot of animals, they recognize food as being a positive thing. Whole nuts that are in the shell, other than peanuts, please don't give birds peanuts. They can contain fungal organisms that are toxic to birds, and they're just not healthy. But whole walnuts and cashews and things like that are great foraging for birds. It's great exercise for their beaks, for their feet. It teaches them to manipulate. And it can take some birds quite a long time to get in there and crack these nuts. Sometimes for smaller birds, you can even partially crack these nuts and then give them a half-cracked nut and make them work the rest of it out. And that doesn't require much handling. It's something they tend to enjoy. It's fairly inexpensive as far as you don't have to go buying, expensive foraging toys and things like that. So that's a fun thing, I think, and an easy thing that shelters can do. Bathing is another great way for birds to have enrichment, and it's super healthy for them. Remember, not every bird is going to want to be sprayed. In fact, a lot of them really resent it. So you have to, be careful, again, monitoring body language. But over time, if you take a gentle spray bottle and spray above the bird and kind of let the water fall on the bird, they do tend to recognize and have an innate desire to bathe and to be wet. It's a natural behavior for a lot of birds, and even if they've never had a bath before, they do sometimes learn this. And it's so beneficial. It helps keep their nasal passages clear because water goes up their nose and they sneeze it out. It keeps their plumage in good condition. And I think they really enjoy it. And once they are wet, it takes them a long time. If you've ever watched a wet bird, what they do after a bath is they spend a long time preening and caring for their feathers, and this is a great thing for them to do. So I do consider a bath a form of enrichment that I would encourage and recommend. The picture that I put here of the little bird cage, in the back of the bird cage, if you see, there's a towel, and it is partially pulled through, and behind that towel is a cute little lovebird. I put that in there because sometimes people don't think of enrichment. They think of it as how to keep them busy. And enrichment can also be how to keep them quiet or private. So a lot of times, especially in a shelter situation, a bird might just want to be left alone and might want to be have an opportunity to hide or not be the focus of attention. So even offering a visual barrier of some kind is great. Plus, something like this allows the bird to have something to kind of snuggle against, a comfort zone. So I wanted to mention that as something I think that's important and shouldn't be neglected in even a short-term setting, because it can really make a difference to a scared or nervous bird. And a lot of times, you're going to get birds in that are just terrified and scared and out of their element, and giving them a place to hide and get away is a good idea. Somebody posted a question, could you please go back over why peanuts shouldn't be provided to parrots? So number one, peanuts don't have a tremendous health benefit to birds. There's not a whole lot of nutrition in them that can't be found in other sources, but there are some negative parts of peanuts that we worry about with birds, which is something called aflatoxins that resides. It's a fungal organism that lives in the shells of peanuts, and it is something that we would consider major no/junk food for birds in general. It's a very common thing that people give birds peanuts. They love them. It's kind of like sunflower seeds in that they can become addicted to them, but they just have a very little nutritional value, and in the case of peanuts, they actually can be harmful to birds. So I really encourage people, don't give peanuts. Don't get them started on that bad habit. Give them a walnut or an almond instead, and they'll be much better off for it in the long run, and I would encourage that. So, yeah, I recognize that having an aggressive or a bird that's fractious can be tough to socialize with, but other things that I would recommend would be non-contact interactions, singing and dancing. You kind of have to have the crazy people like me at your shelter facility to be that person who's going to play music and sing and dance and party with the birds, but they love it, and it's a way to interact with them and physically stimulate them and give them some fun in the day. It doesn't require a lot. It's cheap. It's not going to, require any sort of expensive toys, and it can be a lot of fun for everybody and sometimes bring a fractious bird out of their shell. So you're not going to, in a short-term setting, train a bird that's vicious to step up and give you a kiss, but you can give it a good quality of life while it's there and set it up for some more positive behaviors down the line. All right, next. What if a bonded pair of birds are being destructive to one another, such as overpreening? Can you suggest ways to minimize these behaviors without having to separate them? Like I said, you would never consider separating this cute little pair of conures. Or actually, that looks like a macaw. Maybe they're both. That's a yellow-collared. I don't know. Without those feathers, it's kind of hard to tell what the other bird is. It looks like a yellow-collared macaw. But either way, they're obviously very bonded. And yes, one of them is at least overpreening the other one. This is a complicated question because the answer is the same as if it were just one bird that's overpreening itself. I mean, usually what happens in these situations is one bird develops a feather-destructive behavior on itself and then turns that on to the other bird and overgrooms that bird, or even teaches that bird, hey, look at this is cool, look what I'm doing, and they teach them a bad habit. So what's true for one lone bird is going to be true for two, and that's giving these birds things to do other than overgrooming themselves. Now, remember that some of overgrooming and feather-destructive behavior is based on a medical problem. So once you've determined with your vet that this is not a medical problem and you've determined this is, in fact, purely behavioral, you can start thinking about ways to fix it. And this is a whole topic in and of itself that I just can't get into right now, but what I will remind you all is that preening and grooming is a normal part of a bird's day. They spend much of their day getting their feathers intact, spreading their oil from their preen gland around to waterproof them. It's a normal part of behavior. They preen themselves and they preen their friends. What happens in captivity is they have nothing else to do, so they overdo it. They just preen themselves too much, and then that turns into damaging the feathers, and then that turns into chewing the feathers. And then that, because the feather's chewed, it's uncomfortable, so they pull it out. That pulling out of the feather creates some sort of a response. I'm not saying they like it, but it creates a response, and they do it again. And that's how the habit forms. So we just need to focus on giving them other things to do, whether it's foraging, bathing, flying, making them look for food. Birds like this, the first thing I would do would be to not give them a huge bowl of food. They would immediately have to work for their food. Give them something to do all day long other than chewing on themselves and chewing on each other. But again, this is a long topic. Just know that that's your goal, is going to be giving them something to do. But you're not going to fix this in a short-term situation. So just focus on not splitting them up, and certainly you can learn more about this stuff online. Somebody has another comment about peanuts. I'm going to flip back to it real quick. There's specific volunteers who always bring peanuts in, constantly telling them not to bring them. He knows they're bad, but doesn't listen. We can throw them away, but he'll just bring them in another time. Any suggestions on telling a volunteer who doesn't listen? Well, I wouldn't let them volunteer anymore if they can't abide by your rules. You could give them other nuts to substitute. You could give them nutriberries, which is another good substitute. Birds tend to like them, and they're healthier than seeds. If you haven't heard of them, it's a product that Lefever's makes called nutriberries. I like those as treats for birds. I think you just need to put your foot down. I think volunteers are great. I hate to see you lose a volunteer, but they have to abide by your instructions, or they're kind of useless to you, and they could potentially be causing harm. So you need to have a stern conversation with them. All right. What's up next? I think we're nearing the end of our questions. Maybe that was our last question, yeah. We're on resources. I'm going to turn this back over to Denise. I don't see other questions here. If anybody has them, feel free to ask them now.
Thank you, Lorelei. Yes, actually, I did want to get everyone's attention back to the how-to guides that we have online at avianwelfare.org/shelters, as some of those downloadable guides address many of the topics that Lorelei touched on today, things like supportive care, enrichment within the shelter, simple enrichment, how to minimize stress, which is a big topic in shelters for birds. So please feel free to go to our website and check out those how-to guides. In the meantime, I know that Kelly had mentioned the new series that we will be doing on adoptions, and we will make that very similar to this. Will be very interactive. So even if you have any questions in the meantime, you want to send them to me personally at info@avianwelfare.org, and I would be happy to start to line those up. So we can start to prepare the agenda for that meeting. Kelly, can I turn it back over to you for a few minutes?
Yeah.
Any last minute things to say?
I just wanted to thank Dr. Tibbetts for doing this today. I think today we had a lot of great questions and some great information, and I've really been enjoying the roundtable format, so that your questions that you all deal with every day, we can help you get some answers to those. Denise just mentioned that we're going to do something similar with adoptions and placement. Another series that we're considering is on behavior. Lorelei mentioned how challenging it is and complicated, and that's something that we've recognized too, is that it really deserves its own discussion. So you can look forward to that as well. And then I just wanted to thank Robin with GFAS for helping on the technical aspects and other behind-the-scenes work. And I just appreciate everybody joining us today, and I hope you can look forward to more of these discussions.
And just to Lisa Bono, who just asked if she could share our resources with her county animal response team. And yes, we encourage you to go to the GFAS Avian Education page and share all of the resources, including our recordings from last year. And these recordings from this series will also be on. One of them is already on, and today's will be up probably by next week. And just the final word, parrots are a long way from their native homes, and we know it's very challenging to care for them in the shelter, but just think of what they have to deal with dealing with us. So your care and your patience really is the answer, and even though shelter environment is not the ideal environment, it probably is better from where some of these birds came from. In other cases, people have to give them up for reasons that they don't want to, death, illness, or something. So we're all in this to make the best of a situation that's not ideal. And I thank you again for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you on our next series.
Great. Thank you, Denise.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Do I just hang up?